everybody! So today I wanted to do a little video and talk about how I became a software engineer, even though I don't have a CS degree and I did not go to a coding bootcamp. And yes, it is a little bit of a weird story, but I had an amazing opportunity, and I think the best thing that I've ever done for my career is every time I've had a weird or crazy opportunity, I've taken it, even if I wasn't super sure about it. And I owe a lot to the mentors and the people in my life who pushed me into it and gave me the chance to really prove myself, and I've really enjoyed being a software engineer. So hey, if you're new here, my name's Anastasia, and my channel is about quantum computing, coding, and tech, so make sure to subscribe if you want more videos on that. So the reason I felt a little bit weird about telling my story is because I didn't feel like my story was maybe as replicable as other people's stories. A lot of people went to coding boot camps and had a lot of interview prep or had a CS degree or something like that that really helped them get the foot in the door. And my story seemed a little bit random until I realized that I'd worked at 2 companies and I'd almost become a software engineer at both of them. So what really happened to me is I started working at a company in a non-computer science, in a non-software engineer role, and actually became a software engineer. So then I started thinking, there's definitely a pattern there, and I realized there were several things I did to kind of help move me into those roles, and also I just happened to be at the right companies, and I think those patterns are really important, that if you want to do this sort of path, you can actually do it at a lot of companies, but finding the right environment and doing those steps to get there, maybe not a lot of people know about. So like I mentioned, I was working for a company in a different role. I was a technical account manager there, and I'd been working at the company for a while and kind of doing little code things. So I studied physics. I kind of knew how to program, but I didn't know how to software engineer. And let me tell you, those 2 things are very, very different. So I had expressed a little bit of interest in coding and was doing little coding projects in my other role, and it was kind of a split role. So I was doing a little bit of business, but a little bit of technical stuff as well. So I was getting my hands on code, I was just not a software engineer. And I still remember how this happened. It was after our company kickoff. We have one once a year. Everyone's in the same place, it's hundreds of people, and I had the flu. So I'm super sick, I'm laying in bed, and my manager calls me. I'd already posted my AFK I'm sick, and he's like, hey, so you're moving to engineering. And I was so sick that I thought it was a joke. And because I'd expressed interest in becoming a software engineer, but I hadn't really interviewed, and I knew a lot of people on the engineering team, but there wasn't like a formal process in place. So I actually thought it was a joke and kind of hung up the phone and went, yeah, okay, and went back to sleep. That was a weird phone call. I didn't interview for software engineer, but isn't that such a cool opportunity? Maybe I just dreamt it or something. And then I filed a JIRA ticket to my CTO. He was doing a few things our CTO coded all the time. And so I filed the JIRA ticket to him. He messages me like, I moved you to engineering and you just filed JIRA tickets to me. Soon you'll be able to do them on your own. And that was the moment where I realized that it was actually a legit thing and I was actually moving to become a software engineer. I'd been at the company 8 to 9 months at that point. So at that point I also realized that the meetings I was having with engineers at the company kickoff, where they were just taking me through their presentation and kind of talking to me a little bit about what they were doing, seeing if I understood, that was kind of my interview, but it was very informal. I didn't do a HackerRank interview, I didn't have any formal meetings with anyone. I'd already worked closely with engineering before, so they had kind of already known my personality type and had worked kind of closely with me to know what I knew and what I didn't know. And honestly, I did not know a lot. And when I say I didn't know a lot, let's talk about the background that I did have. I did start coding a little bit when I was 12 or 13 years old, back on Neopets. If anyone else played it, I would actually code the pet pages, so that was one thing. That's when I learned HTML, CSS. And also there was this thing at the time where you could make money by buying things low in the shops and selling them high. And it was just like you had to be very fast to grab those items from the shop. And so I started learning how to code because I started trying to make sniper bots to buy these things in Neopets. Besides that, I was part of the robotics team in high school, and I actually went to a specific high school and I applied for it to get into it. It was a magnet high school for math and science, so you had to apply and take a test to get in, but I really wanted to because they had an amazing robotics team, and when I was there in high school, I was part of the team for the 3 years that I was in high school. And in college, I ended up taking just one course on computer science. It was Intro to Python. And let me tell you, Intro to Python was pretty easy for me at that point. I had already done some C programming, but honestly, I hated Python at that point. Like, Python was too much magic for me. And even though I declared as a computer science major, I ended up switching my major to physics after that and never taking another CS course. But even though I never took another class, I liked coding for fun, and in physics you would still have to do some coding, but it's pretty much just for yourself, just for experiments, so it's very different from software engineering. Again, like I mentioned, physicists are pretty good coders and programmers, but they are awful software engineers, and I learned that up front when I had my first job. And after college, I started my company, and my co-founder was actually a CS major, so while he did most of the coding, sometimes we'd have crunch time and we'd sit there and be like, well, we have to build this thing and it's due tomorrow and we want to push it out to our users. So I'd sit there and I'd code as well. But again, my coding knowledge was very scattered. It was very coding. It was not computer science. I didn't do data structures and algorithms, and I didn't do graph theory. I didn't do any of that. So after I graduated, I was interested in software engineering, but I knew I couldn't pass the interview without a lot of studying and going through the LEET code and the hacker rank and all those things. So I decided to go for these mixed technical and business roles because I still wanted to really use my technical skills, but I also wanted to still be good at talking to people. And as y'all know, physicists and computer scientists were sometimes not the best at being extroverts or talking to people. And even now, even though I've been doing YouTube for a while, it's still a little hard for me to film and do the speaking, but I really wanted to be good at it because my dream was maybe to start another company one day. So going back to this job that I got, I was in a mixed technical and business role. I was a technical account manager. And because it was a little bit at an early stage company, a lot of the roles are really flexible at that point. So I was able to actually concentrate a lot more on the technical side because my manager would let me, and I was working with some of the biggest customers. And, you know, again, you're at that early stage, you're kind of doing anything possible for your customers. So it was great. Instead of the engineers having to build a feature, I could kind of hack something out really quickly. So in this role, not only would I be maybe hopping on the call to debug something with the customer, but I'd also be doing strategic technical direction and giving them the best practices that we need to do and little hacky workarounds, but I'd also be actually writing code and writing scripts to help them out. So because of this, and because of the size of the company, and because of the actual customers I was working with, they were pretty technical and pretty large, important companies, I actually got to work a lot with our CTO, our directors of engineering, and a lot of engineers one-on-one. So at some point, I started saving the engineers a lot of time because I knew so much about the system, and I was like, I can do this task, and actually took time away from engineering and did it myself. So that was great for everyone. So because I'd already worked at my company for months in the previous role, they already knew a little about me in that I could kind of code, but more importantly, I could learn really quickly and work really independently. They also knew that I was really ambitious and I would work really hard to tackle any challenge in front of me. And the most important thing is I could break the system because I knew it well enough at this point to break it all down and find all the little workarounds and bugs in our code. So funny story, actually, a couple months before I was actually moved to engineering, I actually melted some servers because I bulk uploaded a lot of data. And to be fair, I had asked the engineers if that was okay and if it would break anything, and they said it was okay. And spoiler alert, it was not okay. So then I want to talk a little bit about the first 6 months of me making the transition. And I have to say the first 6 months were really hard. Again, I came in with very little background in software engineering and not a lot of core coursework. So it was rough. I mean, honestly, to tell you the truth, I was working on the weekends 6 to 8 hours, at least one of the days, but usually a second day as well, just to feel like I was catching up because not only was I trying to do my job, but I was trying to learn to be a software engineer. And I talked a little bit in some of my other videos about this, but I had a lot of resources and I just went through the tour of Go, I went through the Golang programming language, and I borrowed a computer architecture book from one of my friends. I went and took so many Coursera courses. I was doing that all after hours on top of doing my job. So one of the biggest gaps for me was obviously terminology, and even though there's a limited amount of concepts in coding, the terminology and explaining these things and where I would have an issue, that was, I think, one of the hardest things about not having a CS degree or having any formal education. In some ways at the company, I looked out a little bit because we were using Go, which is a language that's not really commonly used. So pretty much everyone that comes into the company and becomes a software engineer has to learn Go from scratch. So there are a lot of people learning. It also does have a lot of really new concepts, even if you've coded before. So for example, interfaces in Go, even my team lead who has a PhD in computer science mentioned that interfaces took a while for it to really click for him as well. And I also had an additional challenge here in that I was the only engineer in the location that I was at. And so I was remote from everyone else that could help me. And I'm not going to talk about this in this video, but stay tuned and subscribe if you want to look forward to an upcoming video on remote software engineering. I'll talk a little bit about that, but that was an additional challenge when I couldn't just lean over to someone and ask a question. I had to be very independent. But in the end, I knew one of the reasons they hired me was because I already had the culture fit, and I did have a really strong mathematical background, but also I had proved that I could work really hard. But again, it was still hard, and I had to work a ton, and I felt flat on my face a lot. And I basically had to create my own computer science degree and go through it myself in basically 6 months to a year. But eventually I got there and I got to a good place. And one thing I did learn throughout this whole process was that actually coming from no background was a little bit of an advantage for me because I could ask any question I wanted and nobody had any expectations that I knew anything about coding. So I could really ask anything and not feel stupid. But I also realized that working as a software engineer was actually very different than studying in school computer science. Those are two different skill sets. I mean, there is some overlap, obviously, but the software engineering role has so much additional work that you need to learn on top of it. You have to learn so much more about software architecture and how your code fits into everyone else's code in this large code base, how to debug a system that you don't know every piece of, how to deploy your code and test it, how to actually work with customers and product. And these are all things that you might not learn in school or a boot camp. And one of the best things to do when you're new in software engineering is to ask more questions because it's your team's job to really train you. I actually made my first pull request on day 2 of my new job. But did I have imposter syndrome? I mean, yeah, of course I did. I was afraid that every time I would screw up, someone would look at me and be like, yeah, of course she screwed up. She doesn't have any background in computer science. What could she possibly know? I still remember my first Sev 1. So we have Sev 0, which is the worst, but Sev 1 is still not great. You do get paged overnight if there's a Sev 1. And I'll talk about that in a different video, and I'll talk about how I crashed production, and I've done it a lot since then. That's okay, that's totally normal, but it was terrifying to me and it really gave me a lot of imposter syndrome and made me think that I wasn't cut out for it. And let me tell you, bugs and mistakes and even Sev 1, Sev 0s do not mean that you're a bad engineer. As you get more and more senior in your software engineering role, actually you're more likely to create Sev 0s and Sev 1s because just the code you're looking at and working with is a lot harder and you're working on harder tasks. If an engineer has no bugs, they're not doing hard enough work. That's my opinion. So one of the best things that you can do when you screw up is just breathe, relax. It'll be totally okay. If you're in a good job environment like I was, remember that it's not totally your fault because number 1, someone had to review your code so they thought it looked okay. And number 2, if you screw up in any operational things, well, there should be guardrails anyway. I mean, we all saw the HBO integration test email that just came out, right? They said it was an intern, but honestly, if an intern was able to do that, that's kind of senior engineering's fault that they didn't have the guardrails in place. Now, despite not having a formal interview process and despite not having the degree or a boot camp, I did get my first job. I got promoted, which means it's now going to be a lot easier for me to find a new software engineering role if I ever want to do that. Because now I kind of have the proof that I succeeded at a software engineering job, even without a CS degree. And you can get that experience in different ways. For example, another way to do this, if you can't go straight to a job and go through this path, or you don't have time to commit to a boot camp, is to actually pick up freelance gigs. Freelance software engineering interviews tend to focus a little more on your portfolio and what you can actually build, instead of focusing on your degrees or how good you are at LeetCode. And like I've mentioned, this has happened to me twice. Well, the first company, I didn't actually move to software engineering. I left, joined this company that then promoted me to software engineering, and I actually did that for a while. But I feel like there's a pattern to companies where this is more common. But first, why would they even hire you instead of hiring someone externally? Well, first of all, good employees are actually really hard to find, and it costs a lot of money to hire someone new, way more money than it costs to retain someone. So if you're a good employee and you want a new challenge, if you're in a good environment, most companies will give that to you because they want to see you grow and they want to see you grow your skills and become valuable and happy. And if you want to become a software engineer, well, that's great. Software engineers are really high in demand. And again, you're always taking a risk when you hire someone, but if you're already internal in the company, it's less of a risk because you know that person, you know they're a culture fit. So the question is, can you train them to code? That seems like a lesser risk than someone that's coming in that also may not be the best coder, but also may not get along with the rest of the company. So here's what I saw in common with the companies that I've seen this happen to me and to my friends. These are the companies where it's more likely you can move from a different role into a software engineering role. So my first tip is to actually look at Glassdoor. And I noticed that the companies that I was applying to where I heard the stories of employees moving, the employees on Glassdoor in their reviews talked a lot about how long people had been at the company, that there was room for promotions and there was actually room to change roles. The second tip is I think the company can't be too small. And I've been working at other startups that are completely tiny, and it's very hard to move laterally in those sorts of companies. The trick is you want a company that's large enough where you have enough senior engineers to be mentors and they can actually be patient with you as you're learning. At a very small company, they'd want you to be ramped up very, very quickly, and a lot of people just don't have that time to actually grow the software engineers. I really found that companies with about 300, 400 people, maybe about 100 engineers were kind of the sweet spots where on one hand you had enough engineers to actually be able to train someone new. On the other hand, they weren't large enough that there was a lot of like bureaucratic processes and formal interviews. It could just happen. So additionally, the company can't be too large. So I already mentioned that maybe it's better that there's not a lot of formal interviews because they might make you still go through the traditional process with a CS degree or formal LeetCode code questions. But the nice thing about these smaller companies is that you can work directly with the people you'd be working with in the future. It can actually build those connections and start your mentorship early and have them advocate for you. So because of the company I was at, it was pretty small, I got to work directly with a CTO. I knew a lot of the engineers by name. I would hang out with them. I mean, I built such a bond with them that I showed that I could learn this, that I was smart, that I could code, and I could be a part of the team. It's pretty rare to have an opportunity to work that closely with that many senior members of a whole different organization in a lot bigger companies. And because I worked so closely with so many higher up people, they actually had decision-making power to be able to move me to this role. So another thing I look for is really agile companies. So one of our company values was bias to act, and I really liked it because it gave me a lot more flexibility on my projects. This allowed me to pick up projects that I was really interested in, and of course I focused more on coding because I wanted to be a software engineer eventually. So that flexibility allowed me to actually build up my skills while I was not a software engineer yet, but actually start building programming skills, software engineering skills before formally transitioning over. My boss often worked on career plans with me and really supported these technical side projects when I said I was interested in them. And as I transferred to engineering, I also had a lot of support. So senior members of the engineering team would run little classroom workshop sessions with me and with other new incoming engineers and would actually kind of fill in the gaps on our formal education. So honestly, I didn't come into this job with a plan to become a software engineer, but it did happen. So the question is, why did I choose this path and why didn't I study and interview for a software engineering role before? So I had the physics background and I had some coding background, but when I looked at articles on how to actually get a software engineering job, all it focused on were articles about like, hey, how I spent a year studying for the software engineering interview at Google, and that kind of didn't really draw me that much into it. Honestly, knowing how to code and knowing how to pass a software engineering interview are two completely different things, and I think I've personally proved that having moved into a software engineering job when I could probably not pass a software engineer interview at that point and still succeed shows that those two skill sets do not really correlate to success. And this is why I really focus on getting that first foot in the door, whether it is through freelance gigs or something like that. I do believe that the best interview you could do with a person is actually sit next to them and code something together for half a day or a day and see how you work with them. Unfortunately, that's a really, really expensive endeavor to do in a formal company, but in freelance gigs, I saw these types of interviews all the time, and that will help you get a foot in the door. And honestly, eventually I probably would have sucked it up and done the interview training. I'd also consider doing the CS degree at Georgia Tech, the online one, to learn more computer science. However, my life changed very quickly when I got this role and got promoted internally from non-software engineering to software engineering, just by doing little coding projects, being in a company that was enabled to actually help me along this career path. And do I think my path is the only way? And no, of course not. If you're in college and you know that you want to become a software engineer, do the computer science degree. There's no reason not to. I just didn't have that. And I want to say again, I do understand there was some luck involved for me, but also I had a very strong math background from physics and I kind of played that up. And I really pursued a lot of side projects and self-teaching in coding to prove that I had the capability to actually learn how to do this. And I was at a company that was equipped to help me along this path and also would support me through this process. Boot camps are also another great option if you don't have this opportunity, or maybe you're at a company where moving from your role to software engineering is not an option. Sometimes there's baby steps you could do. Maybe there's a technical success engineer position, or you can move into the quality org, or I've seen people moving from operations and security roles into software engineering. So if you're working at a job right now and they'd potentially be set up to help you in this career transition, it never hurts to ask. And again, that's something that I think I've done great in my career so far, is taken these opportunities and grabbed them and just gone fully into them. In the end, this was my path. I do wish sometimes I got into software engineering a little bit earlier. I do wish sometimes I'd studied computer science instead of physics, but right now I'm really happy where I am. And I really enjoy coding, and I really enjoy having that software engineering background and having the physics background and being able to combine those two. So this was more of a story time video, and I hope you enjoyed it. And I have a couple other videos where I talk about my first 6 months of engineering, but if you have any questions about my journey or any resources I could help you out with, just let me know and comment down below.